This is Rich Taylor, Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, and the topic of this presentation is the various ways that organic chemists use in order to depict structures in papers and textbooks. The objective is that you finish this presentation with an understanding of condensed structures, bond line structures, and a little bit of a beginning of looking at structures as 3D molecules. First, it's important to talk about why this shorthand notation that we use in these contexts is important. Organic molecules have many atoms. If we had to draw the full Lewis structure, including every carbon and every hydrogen in the entire molecule, you would find that it's a very laborious process and that it's fairly easy to miss the forest for the trees. That is to say, there are so many atoms in so many different places that you're just not going to be able to know where you should focus your attention. And also, these kinds of drawings take up a lot of space, and in journals and books it's important to try and keep things fairly compact. We're going to assume that you are familiar with Lewis structures, that you're familiar with hybridization, and you understand formal charges. That is to say, then, that the full array of information you can get from a Lewis structure is more or less second nature to you. When we use a shorthand, the important thing to understand is what assumptions you're making. And that is to say, we're not going to use a shorthand if there are very strange structural features that need to be highlighted. In other words, when we use a shorthand form of structure, we're going to use mostly structures that have the octet rule obeyed and that have the standard valences. That is, carbon's going to be tetravalent, nitrogen will be trivalent with a lone pair, oxygen divalent with two lone pairs, and halogen and hydrogen are going to be monovalent. Whenever that's not the case, we're going to use formal charges as more or less a flag that an unusual bonding situation obtains. And so, the first thing to consider are condensed structures. These were very, very important in older journals because older journals had to be typeset. Then, that is to say, then, it was very important to try and fit letters on a regular line. Drawing a picture in typeset journals was really quite a chore, and so putting things into one line was useful. It may not be done quite so much now when it's easier to do pictures, but you're still going to be looking at old journals, and so understanding what these condensed structures means is still going to be important to you. The idea then is that everything's on the same line. So anything that is not part of the main chain is going to be placed along the main chain as close to the atom where the branch is as possible, especially hydrogens. And then we're going to adjust the bonding in order to obtain the standard valences. Here are some examples. Here is a Lewis structure of hexane. So you can see all the carbons and all the hydrogens, and you should also be able to see that that's taking up quite a bit of space. So instead we can draw it as the following way. CH3, CH2, 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 CH3. You lose no information there if you just understand what you know about valence. The important thing is to read from left to right. So you have a carbon. Carbon's bonded to four things. What's that first carbon bonded to? 3 hydrogens, and then the next thing, the carbon. That carbon's also bonded to four things. You already bonded it to the carbon on the left. There are 2 hydrogens that are bonded to it, and the fourth bond is then to the next carbon, etc., etc. You can condense this even further, as you see below, with CH3s and then parentheses CH4, 2 carried 4 times to the final terminus CH3. And here we can now see what you do with side chains. It's the same idea, and the CH3 and the 3 CH2s are quite easy. Now look at what happens when you reach this CH branch. Here is the carbon. The carbon's bonded to 4 things. One thing it's bonded to is the previous carbon. The next thing it's bonded to is a hydrogen. What are the other 2 things it's bonded to? 2 different carbons, each of which is a CH3 group. If the branch is at a different spot, you just put the CH3 where it occurs. And so you can see that the 4th carbon is a CH that has a hydrogen, a carbon, a CH3, and then the other carbon, showing these 2 side chains. When you place heteroatoms in there, you can then see that the crucial CH that has a heteroatom, that's bonded to four things: a carbon, a hydrogen, an oxygen. That oxygen is bonded to what? It's bonded to a hydrogen. Those come together. What's the fourth thing bonded to that carbon? A CH3 group. It's interesting to see then how these condensed structures treat double bonded species. If you go here, you can see then that it's not clear how that carbon is bonded to four things. It's bonded to a carbon, an oxygen, and another carbon. It's not bonded to these hydrogens. Those hydrogens are bonded to that carbon. So to have this carbon being tetravalent, we're going to need a C double bond O. That may seem a little bit complicated, but when you get some practice with condensed structures, it's going to come out very easy. Here are some more examples, and now the pattern should be fairly familiar to you. Proceed normally along the chain. When you get to the highly branched chain, you have a hierarchy of somewhat less to somewhat more complicated. That carbon is bonded to a hydrogen, an oxygen which is bonded to a methyl group, and then a methyl group at the end. Once again then, there's a final structure to look at. This case now, it can actually be kind of complicated just what the structure of that fairly complex side chain is, and so we put that whole side chain in parentheses in order to have them separated out. Well, this is a nice way for typesetters, but there are even more efficient shorthand ways of looking at these, and that's the bond line structure. The bond line structure is an important thing for the student to begin to understand. As a matter of fact, it's the first spot where many students begin to really lose contact with the essence of organic chemistry, and so it's important to make the reading of bond line structure sort of second nature to you. This is the most rapid way to display structures, and it's essential for rings and complex structures. Lots of assumptions go into a bond line structure. Firstly, every line is a bond. It's a pair of electrons calling for a bond. If I don't show you the atom, it's a carbon. If I don't even show you the bond, there are hydrogens there that fulfill the octet rule. Oftentimes, if the hydrogen's on a heteroatom, oxygen or sulfur, we'll show it, but we almost never show the hydrogens that are on carbon. And so if we go back to the structures we looked at before, you can see now that hexane can now be depicted as just this zigzag. A C on the left is bonded to four things. One of the things is another carbon. What about the other three bonds? They're not shown, so they must be a hydrogen. So there's a CH3 group. If you go to the vertex, you can see that you have a carbon. It's bonded to two things that aren't indicated, so it's bonded twice to carbons, but it makes four bonds. I only show two of them. The other two must be to hydrogen, so that's a CH2, etc., etc. One place that students often get mixed up on this kind of structure is you need to remember that the atoms at the very end are not hydrogens, they are carbons. That's a 6-carbon chain. The hydrogens are not shown at all. As we move along then, it's fairly easy to see how these side chains go. You just go to where the branch is and draw another line for the next carbons. And so these two examples are really quite straightforward. As you get to the vertex where the branching occurs, you just branch off that many carbons. Leave the hydrogens alone to be inferred by knowing the octet rule. When we go to alcohols and ketones, same thing applies. The OH is on a branch, so you can put in an OH. The OH could either be an O bonded to an H, or just OH as we've drawn it there. There's the double bond to oxygen for the carbonyl group. Those are quite straightforward. Remember, everything obeys the octet rule, so sometimes we'll show lone pairs on the oxygen, sometimes we won't, but as long as we haven't shown a formal charge, we know that those lone pairs are there. Finishing off then, we see the side chain O to another carbon, and then we see the more highly branched system. Just remember, every atom, I don't tell you what it is a carbon, and carbons are all bonded to four things. If I don't show you four bonds, there must be hydrogens to make the octet rule complete. Points to note. Under some circumstances, a hydrogen may be highlighted. That doesn't change the structure, it's just to point out the presence of a hydrogen to you. Another thing to point out is that when a carbon is bonded to four groups, the bonds are tetrahedral. When such structural information is important, you'll sometimes use wedged and dotted lines to show groups that are attached to the carbon pointing towards you or away from you. Those are part of beginning to think about the 3D structure of molecules. Here's an example. In this particular C double bond O molecule, you see that a hydrogen shown. That carbon the hydrogen is attached to is still bonded to four things. I've shown you three bonds. Two are to carbon, one is to a hydrogen that I didn't have to do, but there's another hydrogen there. We still obey the octet rule, and so there's a bond to hydrogen. I just didn't particularly want to highlight it in whatever argument I'm making in the journal. Here's a structure of methane, and so you can see that understanding that we have a tetrahedral structure, we can't draw all four hydrogens flat. If we really want to talk about the shape of the molecule, we have to have hydrogens pointing towards us and away from us. And in the same way, you can denote the position of atoms, namely stereochemistry, by using dashes and wedges as well. So at this carbon right here, two carbons that are bonded to this central carbon are in the plane of the slide. The OH is pointing away from you. Since we know that carbon forms four bonds, there's also a hydrogen. It's pointing towards you. We just don't show it. And in the six-membered ring here, we have carbons on one carbon pointing towards you as a side chain, one pointing away from you on a different carbon. Once again, there are hydrogens that fill up the tetrahedral nature. So the hydrogen here that's not shown is away from you. The hydrogen here that's not shown is pointing toward you. At this point then, you should begin to get comfortable looking at structures and moving back and forth between Lewis structures and condensed structures, and particularly bond line structures. The sooner you become comfortable with it, the more sense organic chemistry is going to become for you.